My son forbade me from visiting his basement. The funeral flowers were still wilting on his grave when I finally used that spare key. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. The brass key felt heavier than it should have in my weathered fingers that October morning. I stood outside David's brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, watching the autumn leaves dance across the sidewalk like ghosts of better times. The house loomed before me, 3 stories of red brick and secrets I'd been forbidden to discover. My breath formed small clouds in the crisp air as I fumbled with the lock, my hands trembling not from the cold, but from 68 years of accumulated heartbreak. The smell of his house hit me immediately. That mixture of expensive cologne and fresh paint that had always made me feel like an intruder in my own son's life. The hardwood floors gleamed under the morning light streaming through those tall windows he'd spent a fortune renovating. Everything was pristine, calculated, cold, just like David had become in those final years. I remember the last time I'd stood in this hallway. It was 3 months before his sudden heart attack, and I'd been carrying a casserole dish filled with his favorite lasagna, the same recipe I'd made for 30 years. He had looked at me with those distant eyes and said, "Mom, I appreciate it, but Melanie's on a new diet. We can't really eat that stuff anymore." The dish had felt like lead in my arms as I walked back to my cramped apartment in Queens, the subway ride home stretching endlessly as I wondered when exactly I had become inconvenient to my own child. But that basement door, that white wooden barrier at the end of the hallway, had always been the most painful reminder of how far we'd drifted. "It's just storage, Mom. Nothing interesting down there." His voice had been sharp that day I'd innocently asked about it, sharper than I'd ever heard him speak to Melanie or the children. "Some spaces are private, you know." The words had cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. Now, standing in the silence of his empty house, that door seemed to pulse with possibilities. What had he been hiding from me? What secrets lay beneath the floorboards of our relationship that I'd been too afraid to uncover while he was alive? I walked through the living room first, touching the surfaces he'd touched just weeks before. His coffee mug still sat on the granite kitchen counter, one of those expensive ones with some corporate logo I didn't recognize. The refrigerator hummed with an efficiency that my old appliance in Queens could never match. Everything in this house spoke of success, of a life carefully curated and maintained. Everything except the mother-shaped hole in the family photos lining the mantelpiece. Have you ever noticed how you can disappear from someone's life while you're still breathing? I had become a footnote in David's story, relegated to holiday phone calls and birthday checks that were cashed without acknowledgement. The photos told the truth I'd been avoiding for years. Vacation pictures with Melanie's parents, graduation ceremonies where strangers had taken the seats I should have occupied, Christmas mornings where my absence had become as natural as the tree lights. The basement key hung on a small hook near the kitchen door, labeled simply B in David's precise handwriting. As I lifted it, my mind drifted back to the sacrifices that had built this empire of indifference. I remembered working double shifts at Murphy's Diner on Atlantic Avenue, my feet swelling in those cheap white shoes as I served endless cups of coffee to truckers and night shift workers. Every dollar I'd saved had gone toward David's future. Private school tuition when the public schools weren't good enough, college application fees, that first car that would give him independence. "You don't have to do this, Mom," he'd said when I'd handed him the keys to that used Honda Civic I'd spent 6 months saving for. But his eyes had lit up with possibility, and I'd felt like I was giving him the world. That was 25 years ago, back when my sacrifices still mattered to him. I descended the basement stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight like a countdown to revelation. The air grew cooler, mustier, filled with the scent of old wood and something else I couldn't identify. When I reached the bottom and found the light switch, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them. But these weren't family memories or vacation snapshots. These were surveillance photos, pictures of me taken without my knowledge over the course of years. Me walking to the grocery store on Northern Boulevard. Me sitting alone on the bench outside my apartment building. Me crying on the subway after one of our particularly painful phone conversations. Each image was dated and organized with the methodical precision of someone building a case. My knees nearly buckled as I moved closer to examine them. There I was, captured in moments I thought were private, vulnerable, alone. In one photo, I was clearly counting dollar bills at the kitchen table, money I'd been saving to help him with his mortgage when he'd lost his previous job. In another, I was standing outside his house last Christmas, holding presents I'd eventually leave on his doorstep because no one had answered the door despite the cars in the driveway. But it was the wall of documents that made my blood run truly cold. Bank statements showing deposits I'd made into his accounts over the years, copies of checks I'd written for his children's school supplies, for car repairs, for medical bills he'd claimed insurance wouldn't cover. And there, in a manila folder labeled Mom's Financial Contributions, was a spreadsheet calculating the exact dollar amount I'd given him over 20 years, $147,000. Next to that folder was another one labeled Investment Portfolio. My hands shook as I opened it to find documents showing David's actual financial status. Stock options worth millions, a cryptocurrency portfolio that had accumulated substantial wealth, real estate investments across 3 states. This wasn't a struggling son accepting help from his devoted mother. This was a wealthy man systematically exploiting the woman who had given him everything. The cruelest discovery was a series of printed emails between David and Melanie, dating back 5 years. "She's getting too clingy," he'd written. "We need to establish better boundaries," Melanie had responded. "Maybe if we're less available, she'll get the hint." Their conversation continued with planning how to limit my visits, how to discourage my calls, how to make me feel unwelcome without technically cutting me off entirely. The phrase that haunted me most was David's closing comment. "She's a reliable source of emergency funds, but we can't let her think she's actually part of our daily lives." I sank onto an old chair that had once sat in my kitchen, recognizing the worn fabric that had once provided comfort in my own home. How had it ended up here, in this museum of manipulation? As I sat surrounded by evidence of my son's betrayal, memories flooded back with painful clarity. Every canceled dinner, every rushed phone call, every excuse about being too busy. They hadn't been the natural growing pains of an adult child establishing independence. They had been calculated moves to keep me at exactly the right distance to be useful, but not burdensome. The worst part wasn't the money. Money could be replaced, forgiven, forgotten. The worst part was understanding that my love had been reframed as inconvenience, my devotion reduced to a line item in a budget. I thought about all those nights I'd lain awake wondering what I'd done wrong, how I could be a better mother, what changes I needed to make to earn back my son's affection. I'd never suspected that the problem wasn't my inadequacy. It was my abundance of love in a relationship designed to exploit it. But there was more. A hidden drawer in an old desk revealed documents that made the financial betrayal seem almost minor. David had been forging my signature on legal documents for years. Property deeds, insurance beneficiaries, even my will had been altered without my knowledge. According to these papers, everything I owned would go directly to him, bypassing the charitable donations I'd specifically requested. My final wishes had been rewritten to serve his convenience. Among these papers was a letter I'd never seen, dated just 6 months before his death. It was addressed to a lawyer, discussing the possibility of having me declared mentally incompetent. "My mother is becoming increasingly difficult to manage," he'd written. "Her emotional demands are affecting my family's stability. I think it may be time to consider guardianship options." The letter included a list of my supposed concerning behaviors, calling too frequently, showing up unannounced, making unreasonable financial requests. Every item on the list was either fabricated or twisted beyond recognition. I sat in that basement surrounded by evidence of a betrayal so complete, so systematic, that it redefined everything I thought I knew about my own life. The son I'd raised, protected, and supported had been documenting my every move, manipulating my every emotion, and planning to ultimately control my every decision. I wasn't his mother in his mind. I was a resource to be managed until I was no longer useful. The photographs on the walls seemed to mock me now. Here was my life reduced to surveillance footage, my love transformed into evidence of instability. I found pictures of me talking to neighbors labeled inappropriate social contact. Images of me gardening on my small balcony were marked signs of obsessive behavior. Even a photo of me feeding pigeons in the park had been annotated with irrational animal attachment. My everyday human activities had been pathologized, cataloged, and prepared for use against me. As I climbed back up those basement stairs, each step felt like emerging from a grave I hadn't known I'd been buried in. The house above felt different now, not just cold and unwelcoming, but actively hostile. This wasn't a home where I'd never quite belonged. It was a fortress built specifically to keep me out while keeping my resources accessible. I walked through David's living room one final time, seeing everything with new eyes. That expensive coffee machine, bought with money I'd given him for emergency medical bills. The artwork on the walls, purchased during a difficult financial period when I'd co-signed a loan. Even the grandfather clock that chimed every hour had been funded by my retirement savings, donated during what he'd described as a temporary cash flow problem. The family photos that had excluded me weren't just thoughtless oversights. They were deliberate erasures, carefully constructed evidence of a life that had moved beyond needing me. I understood now that my absence from these images wasn't accidental. It was aspirational. David had been practicing for a future where I existed only as a financial resource, not as a person worthy of inclusion in his happiness. When I finally left his house that day, I didn't lock the door behind me. Let someone else worry about his security systems and expensive belongings. I walked to the subway with a strange sense of lightness, as if I'd finally set down a burden I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The train back to Queens had never felt like such a journey toward freedom. That evening, I called Helen, the retired teacher from down the hall who had become my closest friend over the past year. Helen was everything David wasn't. Present, genuine, interested in my thoughts and feelings without calculating their value to her. When I told her what I'd discovered, she didn't express shock or offer empty platitudes. She simply said, "Now you know the truth. What are you going to do with it?" What was I going to do with it? For 68 years, I'd defined myself through my relationships with others, particularly my son. I'd measured my worth by how much I could give, how much I could sacrifice, how much I could endure without breaking. But sitting in my small apartment that night, surrounded by the humble possessions David had deemed inadequate, I began to see possibility where there had once been only obligation. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I made breakfast just for myself. Not a quick cup of coffee gulped down while worrying about David's problems, but a real breakfast. Eggs scrambled slowly, toast buttered with care, orange juice in a glass rather than swigged from the carton. I sat at my small kitchen table and tasted each bite, marveling at how different food could taste when you weren't eating it with worry seasoning every mouthful. Then I called the bank. "I'd like to speak with someone about my accounts," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. The conversation that followed was revelatory. Yes, I could close the joint account David had access to. Yes, I could remove him as a beneficiary from my retirement funds. Yes, I could change the automatic transfers that had been sending him $300 every month for household emergencies that I now understood had never existed. The bank manager, a kind woman named Maria, seemed unsurprised by my request. "We see this more often than you might think, Mrs. Patterson," she said gently. "Adult children who've become financially dependent sometimes lose sight of appropriate boundaries. She handed me paperwork that would restore my financial independence, each signature feeling like a small act of resurrection. But the real transformation began when I visited David's grave for the first time since the funeral. I'd been avoiding it, partly from grief, but mostly from that familiar guilt that had controlled so much of my life. Standing there by his headstone, I expected to feel sadness or anger or loss. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: clarity. "I loved you," I said aloud, not caring who might overhear. "I loved you with everything I had, and you used that love against me. But I'm still here, and I'm still capable of love. I just need to learn how to love myself with the same devotion I gave to you." The words felt foreign at first, like speaking a language I'd forgotten how to use. But as autumn turned to winter, I began practicing this new vocabulary of self-worth. I started saying no to requests that didn't align with my well-being. I began making plans that centered on my happiness rather than other people's needs. Most importantly, I stopped waiting for phone calls, visits, and validations that had been systematically withheld from me. Helen introduced me to a support group for older adults who'd experienced financial or emotional abuse from family members. I'd always thought of abuse as something that happened to other people. But sitting in that circle of folding chairs in a community center on Roosevelt Avenue, I recognized my story in theirs. There was Margaret, whose daughter had stolen her identity to open credit cards. There was Frank, whose son had moved in to help with expenses and then systematically taken over his finances. There was Rosa, whose grandchildren had been used as emotional leverage to extract money and compliance. "The hardest part," Margaret said during one session, "is realizing that the person who hurt you is someone you raised to be better." The group nodded with the wisdom that comes from shared pain. But there was something else in that room: hope. These weren't broken people. They were people who'd been bent by circumstances but were learning to stand straight again. Through the group, I learned about legal resources available to seniors who'd been exploited by family members. I discovered that elder financial abuse was a crime, not just a family dysfunction. I found out that I had rights, options, remedies I'd never known existed. Most importantly, I learned that I wasn't alone in this experience that had felt so personally shameful. Winter in Queens had always been difficult for me. The short days and long nights seemed designed to amplify loneliness. But this winter felt different. I began taking evening classes at the community college, pottery on Tuesdays, watercolor painting on Thursdays. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, slowly remembered how to create instead of just serve. The clay was forgiving as I shaped it, and the paint flowed with possibilities I'd forgotten existed. In pottery class, I met James, a widower in his 70s who'd lost his wife 2 years earlier. We bonded over our mutual inexperience with the potter's wheel and our shared appreciation for second chances. "I thought my life was over when Eleanor died," he told me one evening as we cleaned clay from our hands. "Turns out I was just ready for a new chapter I'd never planned to write." James didn't need anything from me except companionship and conversation. We talked about books, movies, places we'd traveled or hoped to visit. He never asked for money, never needed emotional labor I couldn't freely give, never made me feel like my value was tied to my usefulness. It was a revelation to discover what relationships could feel like when they weren't built on exploitation disguised as family obligation. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came unexpected contact from Melanie. She called on a Tuesday evening, her voice careful and controlled. "I've been thinking about you," she said. "The kids ask about you sometimes." I listened to her words, hearing both the genuine emotion and the subtle manipulation woven together. She was testing the waters, seeing if the grief for David might have restored my willingness to be exploited. "I found some things of David's," I said carefully. "Some documents and photographs. We should probably talk about them." The silence on her end confirmed what I'd suspected. She'd known about at least some of David's activities. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its practiced warmth. Maybe it's better if we just give each other some space for a while, she said. The children are still processing their grief. It was a threat disguised as consideration, a way of keeping my grandchildren from me unless I agreed to pretend I'd never discovered the truth. Maybe it is, I agreed, surprising us both. For the first time in our relationship, I wasn't fighting for access to my grandchildren or begging for inclusion in family events. I was choosing my own peace over their conditional acceptance. That conversation marked a turning point. Instead of spending my energy trying to repair relationships that had been designed to harm me, I focused on building new ones based on mutual respect. Helen and I started taking day trips together, to museums in Manhattan, gardens in the Bronx, even a wine tasting class that made us both giggle like teenagers. With James, I explored parts of the city I'd lived in for decades but never really seen. We walked through Central Park, visited art galleries in Chelsea, attended free concerts in Prospect Park. The financial changes I'd made allowed me to invest in experiences rather than other people's problems for the first time in years. I upgraded my apartment with fresh paint and comfortable furniture. I bought clothes that made me feel attractive instead of invisible. I started getting my hair done regularly at a salon rather than cutting it myself in the bathroom mirror. These weren't acts of vanity. They were acts of self-recognition, acknowledgement that I was worthy of care and attention, especially from myself. But the most significant change was internal. I stopped checking my phone constantly, hoping for calls that wouldn't come. I stopped planning my days around other people's emergencies. I stopped feeling guilty for having boundaries, for saying no, for prioritizing my own well-being. The critic in my head who'd always found fault with my choices began to quiet, replaced by a voice that was curious about my possibilities instead of critical of my failures. Summer brought an opportunity I never would have considered before. James mentioned that he'd always wanted to visit Ireland, and almost without thinking, I said, "Let's go." The words surprised me as much as they surprised him. I'd spent so many years saving for other people's dreams that I'd forgotten I was allowed to have my own. Planning that trip was an education in delayed gratification, finally finding its reward. I researched hotels, mapped out itineraries, imagined myself walking through landscapes I'd only seen in photographs. For the first time in decades, I was spending money on something purely for the joy it would bring me. There was no one to justify the expense to, no one who needed to approve my choices, no one who could make me feel selfish for wanting to see the world. The trip itself was magical in ways that had nothing to do with the beautiful scenery or charming villages. It was magical because I experienced it without the constant background anxiety that had shadowed so much of my life. I didn't worry about missing important calls or being needed for emergencies. I didn't feel guilty for enjoying myself while someone else might be struggling. I was simply present in each moment, able to appreciate beauty and novelty without the filter of obligation. James and I spent 10 days exploring Ireland together, and somewhere between the cliffs of Moher and the Ring of Kerry, I realized that I was happy. Not just content, not just surviving, but genuinely happy. At 70 years old, I was experiencing emotions I'd thought were reserved for younger people. I felt excited about waking up each morning, curious about what the day might bring, grateful for the freedom to choose my own adventures. When we returned to New York, I found a letter from Melanie waiting in my mailbox. She'd written to tell me that she was selling David's house and wondered if I wanted any of his belongings. The question felt loaded with subtext. Was this an opportunity for reconciliation or another attempt to draw me back into a dynamic that had proven toxic? I visited the house one final time, but not to claim any possessions. I went to that basement and systematically destroyed every photograph, every document, every piece of evidence from David's campaign of surveillance and control. I fed the papers into a small fire in his backyard fire pit, watching as 20 years of manipulation turned to ash. It felt like a cleansing ritual, a way of reclaiming the narrative of my own life. As I drove away from that house in Park Slope, I realized I felt no nostalgia, no regret, no lingering attachment to the life I'd been excluded from. I felt relief. The child I'd raised with such hope and devotion had grown into someone I wouldn't have chosen as a friend. The loyalty I'd maintained despite years of mistreatment hadn't been returned. And finally, I was okay with that. The autumn of my 71st year arrived with a sense of possibility I hadn't felt since my youth. Helen and I had started volunteering together at a literacy center, helping recent immigrants learn English. The work was rewarding in ways that had nothing to do with obligation or guilt. I was useful by choice, appreciated without manipulation, needed in a context that energized rather than depleted me. James and I were planning another trip, this time to the Southwest to see places we'd always wondered about. We weren't rushing toward anything or running from anything else. We were simply two people who enjoyed each other's company and had the freedom to explore that enjoyment wherever it led us. The holidays that year passed without the traditional anxiety. I didn't wait for invitations that wouldn't come or plan elaborate gestures that wouldn't be appreciated. Instead, I hosted a small gathering for friends who'd become family. Helen, James, some people from my pottery class, neighbors who'd shown kindness when kindness wasn't expected. The laughter in my apartment that Thanksgiving was genuine, unforced, free from the undercurrent of tension that had characterized so many family gatherings. As winter settled over Queens again, I found myself reflecting on the year that had passed since David's death and my discovery of his betrayal. The pain was still there, but it had transformed from the sharp ache of fresh wounding to the dull throb of old injury healing. I no longer spent sleepless nights wondering what I could have done differently. I no longer carried the weight of responsibility for someone else's choices. The most profound change was in how I viewed love itself. I'd spent so many years believing that love meant sacrifice, that caring required suffering, that devotion demanded self-denial. I'd confused exploitation with loyalty, manipulation with affection, control with concern. But learning to love myself with the same intensity I'd once directed toward David had taught me that healthy love enhances both people involved. It doesn't diminish one person to elevate another. My grandchildren, now young adults themselves, reached out occasionally through social media. Their messages were tentative, clearly unsure how to bridge the gap that their father had created and their mother maintained. I responded with warmth but without desperation, letting them know I was available without making them responsible for my happiness. Some relationships could be repaired, others needed to be released. I was finally wise enough to tell the difference. On the anniversary of David's death, I visited his grave one last time. I brought flowers not out of obligation, but out of the genuine love I'd once felt for the child he'd been before he became the man who could spy on his mother and document her vulnerabilities. I grieved for both of us that day, for the son who'd lost his way, and for the mother who'd lost herself in trying to save him. "I forgive you," I said to his headstone, meaning it for the first time. "And I forgive myself." The words carried away the last residue of guilt I'd been holding. I was finally free from the story that had defined me for so long, the story of the inadequate mother whose love was never quite enough. Standing there in the cemetery, surrounded by evidence of lives fully lived and completely ended, I made a promise to myself. I would not waste whatever time remained to me serving people who couldn't appreciate the gift of my presence. I would not apologize for taking up space in the world. I would not pretend to need less than I deserved to make others more comfortable with giving me only scraps of attention. The train ride back to Queens that day felt like a journey into possibility. The city looked different from the subway window, not harsh and indifferent, but full of stories and opportunities I'd never noticed while I was focused on trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it freely. I was part of this vast, diverse, complicated community of people figuring out how to live with dignity and hope despite the wounds life had inflicted. Spring came early again, and with it, another invitation from James, not for travel this time, but for something that would have terrified me just 2 years earlier. He'd asked if I'd like to move in together, not out of desperation or convenience, but out of the joy we'd discovered in each other's company. The question required me to imagine a future I'd never dared to consider. One where I was valued not for what I could provide, but for who I was as a person. "I'd like that," I told him, surprising myself with how easily the words came. I was 71 years old, and I was falling in love. Not with the desperate, anxious attachment I'd once confused with devotion, but with the calm, secure affection that comes from recognizing someone who sees and appreciates your authentic self. We found a small apartment together in Astoria, a place that belonged to both of us equally, where neither person's needs dominated the space. We furnished it with things we chose together, cooked meals we both enjoyed, created routines that honored both of our preferences. For the first time in my adult life, I lived somewhere that felt like home, rather than like a service station for other people's emergencies. The view from our living room window showed the Manhattan skyline in the distance, a reminder that even from Queens, even at 71, the horizon was full of possibilities. Helen visited often, sometimes bringing friends from her own widening social circle. Our home became a gathering place for people who appreciated genuine connection over manipulative obligation. I think about that basement sometimes, those walls covered with surveillance photos and financial records, that shrine to exploitation disguised as family duty. But I don't think about it with horror anymore. I think about it with gratitude. Finding that evidence of David's betrayal had freed me from a life sentence I'd imposed on myself. It had shown me that the failure in our relationship hadn't been mine alone, that the love I'd offered had been real even if it hadn't been received with the honor it deserved. The David I'd raised and loved had existed, at least for a while. The little boy who'd hugged me fiercely when I picked him up from school, who'd made me Mother's Day cards with construction paper and school glue, who'd told me I was the best mom in the world, that child had been real. The man who'd spied on me and documented my vulnerabilities had been the same person, but he'd made choices that led him away from the love we'd once shared. I couldn't save him from those choices, just as I couldn't earn my way back to his affection through increasing degrees of self-sacrifice. Love isn't a transaction, though it had taken me 7 decades to truly understand that truth. Love freely given and gratefully received creates abundance. Love demanded and reluctantly provided creates only resentment and exhaustion. Now, at 72, I wake up each morning in a home where I am wanted, not needed. I plan days that energize rather than deplete me. I spend money on experiences that bring joy rather than on obligations that bring only more obligations. I love and am loved without keeping score, without calculating worth, without measuring the return on emotional investment. The city outside our window continues its eternal dance of creation and destruction, arrival and departure, hope and disappointment. But from inside our small apartment, surrounded by the quiet contentment that comes from finally learning how to value yourself appropriately, even New York's chaos feels like a symphony rather than like noise. I've learned that it's never too late to have the life you deserve. But you have to be willing to stop settling for the life others think you should be grateful to receive. You have to be willing to disappoint people who've grown comfortable with your self-sacrifice. You have to be willing to prioritize your own peace over other people's convenience. Most importantly, you have to be willing to love yourself with the same devotion you've offered to others, even when they couldn't appreciate the gift you were giving them. The basement is empty now, sold along with the house to strangers who will never know what secrets it once held. But I'm not empty. I'm full of possibilities, full of second chances, full of the kind of happiness that comes not from serving others, but from serving yourself with the same kindness you've always shown to people who needed your care. As I sit here now, writing these words on a quiet Sunday afternoon with James reading in his favorite chair and Helen expected for dinner, I keep thinking about that moment in the basement when I first saw my life displayed like evidence in a case against me. The shock was overwhelming, but the revelation was liberating. For so many years, I'd been trying to solve a puzzle that couldn't be solved. How to make someone love me who had already decided I was inconvenient to love. Discovering David's deception freed me from that impossible equation. The support group I joined, those folding chairs in the community center basement that bore no resemblance to David's basement of betrayal, became a lifeline I didn't know I needed. Week after week, we shared stories that sounded like variations on the same heartbreaking theme. Adult children who had learned to see their parents as resources rather than as people deserving respect and affection. But we also shared something more powerful than our wounds. We shared strategies for healing. Margaret taught me how to change my locks, both literal and metaphorical. Frank showed me how to research legal aid services. Rosa helped me understand that saying no to manipulation wasn't the same as giving up on love. Together, we created a chosen family based on mutual support rather than exploitation, care that flowed both ways instead of just one direction. The pottery class became meditation in motion. There's something profoundly healing about working with clay that refuses to hold its shape unless you handle it with exactly the right balance of firmness and gentleness. My first attempts were disasters: lopsided bowls, vases that collapsed under their own weight, mugs with handles that broke off when they dried. But gradually, my hands learned the rhythm of creation. The wheel became a metaphor for my life. I was learning to center myself, to apply pressure thoughtfully, to know when to let the clay guide me and when to guide the clay. James was patient with my learning curve in ways David had never been. When I showed him my early pottery attempts, he didn't focus on their imperfections or suggest ways I might do better. He simply said, "Look how much you're enjoying this. Your hands know what they're doing even when your mind isn't sure." He saw effort where others might see failure. He celebrated progress where others might see inadequacy. The financial independence I'd reclaimed allowed me to make choices I'd forgotten I was allowed to make. I could replace my 20-year-old television without guilt. I could buy groceries without calculating whether I'd have enough left over for someone else's emergency. I could plan vacations without worrying about who might need my savings while I was away. For the first time in decades, my money truly belonged to me. But the emotional independence was even more transformative. I stopped answering every phone call immediately, stopped responding to every text within minutes, stopped making myself available at all hours for problems that weren't emergencies. I learned to let other people experience the consequences of their own choices without rushing in to rescue them. I discovered that most of the urgent crises I'd spent years solving had somehow resolved themselves when I wasn't available to fix them. The Irish trip with James was a pilgrimage I didn't realize I was taking. Walking through those ancient landscapes, visiting castles that had weathered centuries of storms, standing on cliffs that had witnessed generations of human drama, I gained perspective on the temporary nature of my own troubles. The pain David had caused me was real, but it wasn't permanent. The love I'd wasted on him could be redirected toward people who would cherish it rather than exploit it. In a small village outside Dublin, we met an elderly woman named Bridget who ran a bed and breakfast with her sister. They'd never married, she told us, but they'd built a life together full of purpose and joy. "People think we missed out," she said with a laugh that had no sadness in it, "but we think we figured out what matters most: good company, meaningful work, and the freedom to choose how we spend our time." She looked at me with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize the newly healed wounds in others. "It's never too late to start putting yourself first, dear. The world won't end if you stop holding it up." Her words stayed with me during the flight back to New York. I looked down at the Atlantic Ocean from 30,000 feet and realized that I'd been drowning for years without recognizing the water level was rising. David's basement had been my personal flood, but discovering it had also shown me where the surface was. I was breathing again, swimming again, choosing again. The decision to destroy David's documentation felt like performing surgery on my own past. Each photograph I fed to the flames was a moment of dignity restored. Each forged document I burned was a step toward reclaiming my autonomy. The fire consumed 20 years of systematic exploitation, but it couldn't touch the strength I'd discovered in surviving it. The ashes that remained were evidence not of destruction, but of transformation. Melanie's attempts to reconnect struck me as both pitiful and calculating. She'd lost her most reliable source of unconditional generosity, and was testing whether grief might make me vulnerable again. But I'd learned to recognize the difference between genuine remorse and strategic positioning. Her apologies were qualified, her explanations were self-serving, and her promises came with implied conditions that left all the power in her hands. I wished her well, but I wished her well from a distance that protected my peace. The grandchildren were a more complicated grief. They'd been weapons in David's arsenal of emotional manipulation, but they'd also been innocent casualties in a war they didn't know was being fought. Some reached out with curiosity about the grandmother they'd been taught to see as needy and intrusive. Others seemed to accept their parents' narrative without question. I offered love without chasing it, availability without desperation, inclusion without requirement. The relationships that could be rebuilt on healthier foundations had that possibility. The ones that couldn't were released with sadness, but without the self-destruction that had characterized my grief over David. The literacy center where Helen and I volunteered provided a different model of usefulness. The immigrants we helped learn English genuinely needed what we offered. But they also gave us something in return. Stories from their home countries, perspectives on resilience, gratitude that felt more nourishing than any thank you I'd ever received from David. These relationships were reciprocal in ways that felt natural rather than calculated. We helped them navigate American bureaucracy, and they helped us understand that renewal was possible at any age, in any circumstances. My apartment in Astoria became a sanctuary in ways my Queens apartment had never been. James and I created rhythms together that honored both solitude and companionship. We cooked together when we felt social and separately when we needed quiet. We shared the newspaper over coffee in the morning and discussed books before bed at night. We took walks when the weather was nice and found indoor activities when it wasn't. Everything was negotiated, nothing was assumed. All of it was chosen rather than obligated. The art on our walls was selected together. Photographs from our travels, paintings from local artists, pottery pieces I'd made in class. These weren't expensive status symbols designed to impress visitors. They were visual reminders of experiences that had brought us joy, creativity that had given our hands purposeful work, beauty that made our daily environment more pleasant. Every object in our home had been chosen because it contributed to our happiness rather than our image. The friends who gathered around our dinner table were people who enhanced our lives rather than who drained our energy. Helen brought her wisdom and humor. James's brother visited from upstate with stories from his garden and his grandchildren. Neighbors from our building stopped by for coffee and stayed for conversation. My pottery classmates came for potluck dinners where everyone brought something homemade. These weren't relationships of obligation or convenience. They were connections chosen and maintained through mutual appreciation. The seasons in New York began to feel different when I wasn't measuring them by David's level of availability or unavailability. Spring wasn't just the time when he might cancel Easter plans. Summer wasn't just when his family vacations would remind me of my exclusion. Fall wasn't just the season when school expenses might require my financial intervention. Winter wasn't just the holidays I'd spend hoping for inclusion. Each season became an invitation to experience the world directly, rather than filtered through someone else's agenda. The city itself revealed aspects I'd never noticed during my years of anxious preoccupation. Queens had poetry in its diversity, languages spoken on every corner, foods from every continent available within walking distance, neighbors from everywhere who'd made this place their home despite leaving everything familiar behind. I began to see myself as part of this community of reinvention, rather than as someone isolated by her family's rejection. But perhaps the most significant change was internal, the quality of my own thoughts when I was alone. For decades, my mind had been occupied by David-related concerns, what he might need, why he might be distant, how I might help, when he might call. Mental space that could have been used for reading, creating, observing, wondering, planning, had been hijacked by worry and strategizing around someone who was actively trying to minimize my presence in his life. With that mental space reclaimed, I rediscovered interests I'd forgotten I had. I returned to reading fiction for pleasure rather than advice books about parenting problems. I started paying attention to current events beyond their potential impact on David's business. I began noticing architecture, weather patterns, seasonal changes in the trees outside our windows. I developed opinions about movies, restaurants, political candidates that weren't shaped by David's preferences or likely reactions. The money I'd spent on David over 20 years, that spreadsheet calculation of $147,000, could have funded so many experiences I'd denied myself in service of his needs. Vacations I'd foregone to pay for his children's orthodontics, clothes I'd declined to buy because he might need help with car repairs, home improvements I'd postponed because he'd described yet another financial emergency that required my immediate intervention. But I chose not to dwell in that arithmetic of loss. Instead, I focused on the possibilities that remained. At 72, I might have 20 good years ahead of me. 20 years of holidays spent with people who wanted my company. 20 years of birthdays celebrated rather than merely acknowledged. 20 years of conversations about subjects that interested me rather than problems I couldn't solve. 20 years of love given and received without keeping score. The pottery class became more than a hobby. It became a metaphor for everything I was learning about myself. Clay responds to confidence but resists force. It shapes beautifully under patient hands but collapses when rushed. It remembers every touch, good or bad, and incorporates that memory into its final form. Working with clay taught me to trust the process, to accept imperfection as part of beauty, to understand that creation requires both vision and willingness to let materials guide the outcome. My relationship with James deepened as we navigated the logistics of combining two lives that had been independently lived for decades. We merged book collections that revealed shared interests we hadn't known we had. We negotiated bathroom schedules that honored each person's morning rituals. We discovered that we both talked to ourselves while cooking, but preferred silence while reading, small compromises that felt generous rather than sacrificial. He introduced me to jazz music I'd never appreciated before, and I shared with him my love of documentary films he'd never considered watching. We found middle ground in museums we both found fascinating, restaurants that satisfied both our tastes, neighborhoods we enjoyed exploring together. These discoveries felt like gifts rather than obligations, additions to our lives rather than subtractions from our independence. The legal changes I made, updating my will, changing beneficiaries, removing David's access to my accounts, felt like acts of self-protection rather than revenge. I wasn't punishing David posthumously. I was ensuring that the patterns he'd established wouldn't continue beyond his death. My assets would go to charities I cared about, friends who'd enriched my life, causes that aligned with my values. My final gifts would reflect my authentic priorities rather than manipulated obligations. The community center support group eventually graduated me, not because my healing was complete, but because I'd reached a point where I could help others navigate similar discoveries about their own families. I began facilitating sessions for newer members, sharing strategies that had worked for me, offering perspective that came from having survived the initial shock and built a new life from its aftermath. These conversations revealed how common my experience was. Behind closed doors in Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx, elderly parents were discovering that their adult children had been systematically exploiting their devotion. The methods varied. Some used grandchildren as emotional leverage. Others created fictional emergencies requiring financial bailouts. Still others simply wore down their parents' resistance through consistent demands disguised as requests for help. But the support group also revealed how possible recovery was. Every week, someone shared a small victory. A boundary maintained, a manipulation recognized and refused, a new relationship built on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. The healing wasn't fast or easy, but it was real. People who'd felt broken by betrayal were reassembling themselves into stronger, wiser versions of who they'd been before. My story became a resource for others, not because my experience was unique, but because my response to it offered hope. If a 70-year-old woman could rebuild her life after discovering decades of systematic exploitation by her own son, then anyone could choose self-respect over continued abuse. The basement full of surveillance photos and manipulated documents had been intended to imprison me in a reality I hadn't chosen. Instead, it became the key that unlocked my freedom. The seasonal rhythms of our new life in Astoria marked time in ways that felt peaceful rather than anxious. Spring meant planting garden boxes for our small terrace. Summer meant evening walks through neighborhoods we were still discovering. Fall meant cultural events that didn't depend on other people's availability. Winter meant cozy evenings with books and conversation that didn't need to accommodate anyone else's schedule or preferences. Each season brought reminders that life was happening in the present moment, not in the future reconciliation I'd spent years hoping for, or the past relationship I'd spent years mourning. The cherry blossoms in April were beautiful because I was there to see them, not because David might someday join me in appreciating them. The beach sunsets in July were meaningful because James and I experienced them together, not because they represented something I couldn't share with my son. The community we built around ourselves felt organic in ways my relationship with David never had. Friendships developed because people enjoyed each other's company, not because they were related by blood or obligation. Invitations were extended because someone wanted to share an experience, not because social calendars demanded it. Conversations flowed naturally toward subjects that interested everyone involved, not toward problems that required solving or emergencies that demanded immediate attention. Helen became the sister I'd never had, someone whose life ran parallel to mine but remained completely her own. We shared books, recipes, observations about getting older in America, but we didn't expect each other to solve problems that required professional help or provide resources that exceeded our capabilities. Our friendship added richness to both our lives without creating burden for either of us. The Literacy Center work connected me to purposes larger than my own healing. Helping recent immigrants navigate systems I'd learned to understand gave my knowledge practical value. Witnessing their determination to build new lives despite language barriers and cultural dislocation reminded me that reinvention was not just possible, but admirable at any age. Their gratitude for small acts of assistance helped me understand the difference between appreciation and exploitation. James's presence in my daily life provided a completely different model of companionship than I'd experienced in my marriage or with David. He didn't need me to complete him or solve his problems or manage his emotions. He enjoyed my company, valued my opinions, appreciated my contributions to our shared life. But his happiness didn't depend on my performance as caretaker or financier. He was whole on his own and chose to share that wholeness with me. Our conversations ranged across decades of experience we'd accumulated before meeting each other. He told stories about his career in civil engineering, travels with his late wife, lessons learned from raising daughters who respected his boundaries while maintaining close relationships. I shared memories from my years raising David, my time working at the diner, my gradual awakening to the possibility that I deserved better treatment from the people I loved. These conversations weren't therapy sessions or advice exchanges. They were explorations of two lives that had encountered both joy and disappointment, success and loss, hope and disillusionment. We learned from each other without trying to fix each other. We supported each other without becoming responsible for each other's happiness. We created together without sacrificing our individual identities. The financial security I'd rebuilt by reclaiming resources David had diverted created possibilities I'd forgotten existed. Small luxuries like fresh flowers for our dinner table, quality ingredients for meals we prepared together, occasional splurges like theater tickets or concert reservations. These weren't extravagances. They were investments in the quality of daily life I'd denied myself during years of emergency savings for other people's fictional crises. But more importantly, financial independence provided psychological freedom. I no longer jumped when the phone rang, worried that someone needed money I couldn't spare. I no longer calculated the cost of every purchase against potential future demands for assistance. I no longer felt guilty about spending my own resources on my own well-being. My money truly belonged to me for the first time in decades. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect. I still occasionally felt pangs of sadness about the relationship I'd hoped to have with David, the grandmother role I'd been denied with his children, the family gatherings that would never include me. Grief doesn't follow schedules or recognize logical arguments about why someone wasn't worth mourning. But the sadness was accompanied by acceptance rather than self-blame, perspective rather than desperation. Some nights I dreamed about David as he'd been as a child. Eager, affectionate, proud of my presence at school events and sports games. Those dreams were bittersweet, but not devastating. The boy in my dreams had been real, had loved me genuinely, had valued my sacrifices appropriately. The man who'd surveilled me and documented my vulnerabilities had been the same person. But he'd chosen a path that led away from that early love. I could mourn the loss without accepting responsibility for the choices that created it. The apartment James and I shared became a laboratory for learning how two independent adults could create a life together without either person disappearing into the arrangement. We maintained separate bedrooms because we both slept better alone. We kept individual bank accounts because financial transparency didn't require financial merger. We pursued some hobbies together and others independently because companionship didn't mean identical interests. These arrangements felt revolutionary after decades of assuming that love meant self-sacrifice, that caring required constant availability, that commitment demanded the erasure of individual preferences. James and I loved each other precisely because we remained fully ourselves within the relationship. We enhanced each other's lives without becoming each other's projects or responsibilities. The support group sessions I began facilitating taught me as much as they helped others. Each story of exploitation and recovery revealed new aspects of the dynamics I'd experienced with David. Each strategy that worked for someone else added to my toolkit for maintaining boundaries and recognizing manipulation. Each success story reinforced my belief that it was possible to build satisfying lives after discovering betrayal by people we'd trusted completely. The most encouraging part of facilitating these groups was witnessing the moment when someone shifted from victim to survivor. It happened at different speeds for different people, but the transformation was always recognizable. The straightening of shoulders, the steadiness of voice, the willingness to make decisions that prioritize their own well-being, even when those decisions disappointed family members who'd grown comfortable with their compliant self-sacrifice. Margaret learned to tell her daughter that financial emergencies requiring immediate cash transfers needed to be verified before money could be transferred. Frank started requiring his son to provide receipts for expenses he claimed to need help covering. Rosa began spending time with her grandchildren in public places where their behavior couldn't be used to manipulate her emotions or extract money. Small changes that created healthier dynamics. But the most significant changes were internal. The growing conviction that they deserved respect, consideration, honesty from the people they loved. The recognition that sacrifice without appreciation became exploitation. The understanding that family relationships weren't exempt from basic standards of mutual care and consideration. The courage to choose their own peace over other people's comfort with the status quo. My story became a template not because it was extraordinary, but because it demonstrated that recovery was possible even in cases that seemed hopeless. If someone could rebuild their life after discovering decades of systematic surveillance and financial exploitation by their own child, then anyone could choose self-respect over continued abuse. The basement full of evidence had been intended to imprison me in a dynamic I hadn't chosen. Instead, it had become the foundation for building something completely new. The seasons continued their ancient rhythm, but I experienced them differently now that my emotional energy wasn't consumed by relationships that demanded everything and returned nothing. Spring brought anticipation of garden projects and travel plans. Summer offered long evenings on our terrace and weekend trips to places we hadn't explored. Fall provided cultural activities that enriched our minds and spirits. Winter created cozy environments for reading, cooking, and conversation. Each season was welcomed for what it offered rather than dreaded for what it might require. No more anxiety about holiday invitations that wouldn't come. No more scrambling to provide financial assistance for seasonal expenses that seemed to multiply every year. No more walking on emotional eggshells around special occasions that had become minefields of disappointed expectations and manufactured emergencies. The community we'd built around ourselves celebrated these seasonal transitions with us. Potluck dinners that showcased everyone's cooking talents. Garden tours that revealed what neighbors had accomplished in small urban spaces. Holiday gatherings that felt warm and inclusive rather than obligatory and tense. New Year's Eve parties where everyone shared hopes for the coming year, rather than complaints about the past 12 months. These celebrations felt genuine in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. People participated because they wanted to, not because they felt trapped by family obligation. Contributions were offered freely, not demanded as proof of love or loyalty. Conversations flowed toward subjects that interested everyone rather than being dominated by whoever had the most dramatic problems or urgent needs. The life James and I created together wasn't perfect, but it was honest. We disagreed sometimes about movies, restaurants, political candidates, vacation destinations. But our disagreements felt safe because neither of us was trying to control the other's opinions or experiences. We could hold different views without either person feeling threatened or dismissed. We could compromise without either person feeling diminished. This relationship taught me what I'd been missing during all those years of trying to earn love through self-sacrifice. James didn't love me because I solved his problems or funded his emergencies or made myself constantly available for his needs. He loved me because he enjoyed my company, valued my perspectives, appreciated the person I was rather than what I could provide. His affection didn't depend on my performance as caretaker or financier. The financial independence I'd reclaimed allowed for choices I'd forgotten were available. Weekend trips that didn't require months of saving. Restaurant meals that weren't calculated against potential future emergencies. Clothes purchased because I liked them rather than because they were on sale. Books bought new rather than borrowed from the library. Small luxuries that made daily life more pleasant without requiring major sacrifices. But the psychological independence was even more valuable. I no longer jumped when phones rang, worried about who might need immediate assistance. I no longer planned my schedule around other people's potential emergencies. I no longer felt guilty about prioritizing my own well-being or saying no to requests that didn't align with my capabilities or interests. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could give or how much I could endure. The pottery classes continued to provide metaphors for everything I was learning about life. Clay that was forced into shapes it couldn't hold would collapse or crack. Clay that was allowed to find its natural form while being guided by skillful hands could become something beautiful and functional. The same was true of relationships, I discovered. The ones that worked were based on mutual care and respect, rather than force or manipulation. My pieces improved as I learned to trust the process rather than trying to control every aspect of the outcome. Bowls that weren't perfect circles still held soup beautifully. Vases with slight asymmetries still displayed flowers gracefully. Mugs with handles that weren't exactly centered still felt comfortable to hold. Perfection wasn't required for functionality or beauty. The same was true of life, relationships, and the process of healing from betrayal. The community center work expanded as I became more confident in my ability to help others navigate similar discoveries about their families. Elder abuse by adult children was far more common than anyone wanted to acknowledge, but it was also far from hopeless. Every week brought new stories of people who'd found the courage to change dynamics that had been harming them for years. Small victories that added up to transformed lives. The legal resources available to seniors who'd been exploited by family members were more extensive than most people realized. Social workers who specialized in elder abuse, attorneys who provided free consultations about financial exploitation, support groups in every borough for people dealing with similar situations. No one had to navigate these discoveries alone or accept continued mistreatment as inevitable. But the most important resource was internal, the growing conviction that everyone deserved to be treated with respect and consideration by the people they loved. Family relationships weren't exempt from basic standards of mutual care. Blood relationships didn't provide license for exploitation or manipulation. Love that demanded constant self-sacrifice wasn't love at all. It was a transaction disguised as affection. The friends we'd gathered around us understood these principles intuitively. Helen had raised 5 children who respected her boundaries while maintaining close relationships. James's daughters called regularly but didn't make demands that exceeded his resources or emotional capacity. Our pottery classmates shared their creative journeys without expecting others to solve their artistic problems. Our neighbors offered help during emergencies without keeping score or expecting reciprocal assistance. These relationships provided examples of what was possible when people interacted from positions of mutual respect rather than exploitation. Caring that flowed both directions. Support that was offered freely rather than demanded as proof of love. Boundaries that were honored rather than constantly tested. Appreciation that was expressed rather than assumed. The seasonal rhythms of our life in Astoria provided structure without rigidity. Spring cleaning that cleared space for new experiences. Summer adventures that created memories worth treasuring. Fall preparations that acknowledged the passage of time without dreading it. Winter reflections that honored both growth and loss. Each season brought its gifts without requiring emotional taxes we couldn't afford. The dining room table where we shared meals with friends became a symbol of everything I'd learned about the difference between nourishing and depleting relationships. Food prepared with care and shared with appreciation. Conversations that enhanced everyone's understanding rather than draining anyone's energy. Laughter that arose naturally from genuine enjoyment rather than being forced to cover uncomfortable tensions. These dinners felt like celebrations of what was possible when people gathered out of choice rather than obligation. Everyone contributed something: food, wine, stories, attention. But no one kept track of who gave what, or whether the exchanges were perfectly balanced. The abundance came from everyone's willingness to participate generously rather than defensively. The books I read, the movies we watched, the places we visited were chosen because they interested us, rather than because they might impress others or solve problems or serve purposes beyond our own enjoyment. This felt revolutionary after decades of consuming culture, primarily as escape from or preparation for difficult family dynamics. Entertainment became genuinely entertaining rather than therapeutic necessity. The money I spent on these experiences had once gone to David's fictional emergencies and manufactured crises. Theater tickets instead of car repairs that insurance had actually covered. Weekend trips instead of grandchildren's expenses that their parents could afford, art supplies instead of medical bills that had been greatly exaggerated. My resources finally served my own well-being rather than someone else's manipulation. But the transformation wasn't just about money or time or energy. It was about the fundamental recognition that I was worthy of care, consideration, and respect, especially from myself. The voice in my head that had spent decades criticizing my inadequacies as a mother began to quiet, replaced by curiosity about my possibilities as a person in my own right. The anxiety that had shadowed most of my decisions began to lift, revealing clarity about what actually mattered to me. The life I was building with James and the community we'd created around us wasn't perfect, but it was authentic. Problems arose and were addressed honestly, rather than being denied or blamed on other people. Disagreements occurred and were resolved through communication rather than manipulation. Needs were expressed clearly rather than being disguised as emergencies requiring immediate self-sacrifice from others. This approach to relationships felt foreign at first after decades of family dynamics based on crisis management and guilt manipulation, but it quickly became natural, even addictive. The relief of knowing that people meant what they said, wanted what they asked for, appreciated what they received was profound. The absence of hidden agendas and ulterior motives created space for genuine connection and mutual support. The seasonal transitions reminded me that change was natural, inevitable, and often beneficial. Autumn leaves falling wasn't a tragedy. It was preparation for winter rest and spring renewal. My relationship with David had ended not because I'd failed as a mother, but because he'd chosen a path that led away from the love I'd offered. The grief was real, but so was the freedom that came from accepting what I couldn't control or change. The view from our apartment window showed a city full of people navigating their own complicated relationships with family, money, obligation, and independence. The lights in other windows represented lives being lived with various degrees of satisfaction and authenticity. Some people were probably discovering betrayals similar to what I'd found in David's basement. Others were probably building the kind of relationships James and I had created together. All of us were figuring out how to love and be loved without losing ourselves in the process. The story I'm telling isn't unique. Too many people have experienced some version of exploitation disguised as family loyalty. But it is a story of recovery, of rebuilding, of learning that it's possible to reclaim dignity and create joy, even after discovering that someone you trusted completely had been systematically violating that trust. The basement full of surveillance photos and manipulated documents had been intended to imprison me. Instead, it became the evidence that set me free. Have you ever discovered that someone you loved had been systematically exploiting your devotion? Have you ever found evidence that your sacrifice was being cataloged rather than appreciated? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story has touched something in your heart, if you see your own journey reflected in mine, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps me keep opening my heart and sharing these truths that too many of us carry in silence. Sometimes the most important liberation is learning that you don't have to earn the love you deserve, you just have to stop accepting less than what you're worth.